Before air conditioning existed, staying cool in summer wasn't just hard, it was a daily survival challenge. No fans, no cold drinks, no flicking a switch for relief. For medieval peasants, beating the heat was all about habits, grit, and pure necessity. Let's start where their sweaty story begins: home. Medieval peasant houses were basically slow cookers with doors. These homes were typically built using something called wattle and daub, a construction method where people wove thin branches together and smeared the entire thing with a thick blend of mud, clay, and yes, animal dung. If you're wondering, yes, poop was a common building material, and yes, that tells you a lot about their home improvement standards. The walls were bulky and heavy, built with rough stones and wooden beams from whatever trees were nearby. While this sounds sturdy, and it was, it created a brutal side effect. These homes would soak up heat during the day and then trap it inside like a sauna long after the sun had set. But the real heat trap? The roof. Most peasants had thatched roofs made of dried grass, straw, or reeds. Thick and dense, these roofs worked like solar sponges, absorbing sunlight all day and slowly releasing that heat into the home around the clock. And as a bonus, not the good kind, they doubled as luxury condos for rats, birds, and bugs. Honestly, the critters probably had better living conditions than the humans below. Floors didn't offer much help either. They were typically just dirt or packed clay, trampled down over the years by countless feet. During summer, these became blazing hot surfaces and kicked up so much dust it was like trying to breathe inside a sandstorm. Imagine living your life on a giant sun-baked mud pie with nowhere to escape. Windows? Don't count on them. Most homes didn't even have glass. It was far too expensive. Instead, peasants had wooden shutters. You could open them to let in air, sure, but that air was hot, dusty, and full of bugs. So you either kept them closed and choked on stale air, or opened them and invited in a sauna with wings. Either way, it was a lose-lose. Ventilation was terrible, and homes were tiny. We're talking whole families crammed into single-room huts, often no bigger than a modern closet. With 6 to 8 people packed in, body heat alone could raise the temperature by several degrees. Think of it as a medieval group sweat lodge, except it wasn't optional. And forget chimneys, those were for the rich. Peasants let cooking smoke drift out through holes in the roof or open doors and windows. So now, not only are you boiling in your own heat, you're doing it in a cloud of smoke. Basically, their version of air conditioning was letting in more heat, and maybe the occasional bird. Another issue: crowded villages. Homes were built right next to each other, leaving no room for air to circulate. Narrow lanes trapped hot air between buildings, turning villages into convection ovens. Living in one of these homes during summer felt like being stuck inside a loaf of bread halfway through baking. But their problems didn't end with the house. Let's talk clothes. Peasants dressed like winter was coming, even in the middle of a heat wave. Their wardrobes weren't about comfort, they were about affordability and survival. Wool was cheap, durable, and everywhere. That meant most peasants wore wool year-round, yes, even in July. The average male outfit? A linen shirt, if he had one, as a base layer, a wool tunic over that, and sometimes a heavy wool cloak on top. 3 layers while working under a blazing sun. Meanwhile, women had it even worse. They wore long linen undergarments and full wool dresses that went from neck to ankle. Even though the dresses were loose, they trapped body heat and limited airflow. And if you were married, you had to cover your head too, usually with another piece of linen or wool. That's right, an extra layer, just for your scalp. Now, linen was at least somewhat breathable and cooler than wool, but it was still considered a luxury. It was expensive, hard to clean, and most peasants only had 1 or 2 linen garments they wore on repeat. Without regular washing, those linen layers became heat-retaining sweat sponges, like wrapping yourself in a damp towel fresh from the sauna. Wool had its upsides. It was durable, local, and still offered warmth when wet, which was helpful in other seasons. But in summer, it was a nightmare. Peasant-grade wool wasn't soft and cozy. It was thick, rough, and itchy. It trapped body heat and sweat like it had a personal vendetta. Washing clothes was another ordeal. Peasants had to heat water over an open fire, howl it by hand, and scrub garments using harsh soaps made from animal fat and ash. It took an entire day, and drying required perfect weather. So most folks did laundry only a few times per year. You wore your clothes until they were stained, stiff, and barely held together. And yes, that made the summer heat feel 10 times worse. Most peasants owned just 2 or 3 outfits in total. That meant wearing the same sweaty, grimy, heavy set of clothes for weeks, sometimes months. The concept of seasonal fashion didn't exist. The idea of summer wear, laughable. They didn't have cooling fabrics. They had wool or more wool. Footwear wasn't much better. Leather shoes were expensive and rarely fit well. Many peasants simply went barefoot during summer. Walking on scalding dirt roads or sun-baked fields without shoes hurt, but not as much as wearing thick, sweaty leather boots all day. And don't even think about shedding layers. Public modesty was serious business. Removing your outer tunic in public, even if you were about to pass out from heat, was like showing up to church in your underwear. Technically possible, socially suicidal. But despite all this, medieval peasants did what humans do best. They adapted. When the heat became unbearable, they didn't just sit and suffer. They got creative. The simplest fix? Get out of the house. When homes turned into furnaces, entire families would grab their straw bedding and head outside. They'd set up sleeping areas in gardens, yards, or even right in the middle of the village street. Was it comfortable? Not really, but it was better than baking indoors. Shade became survival. People planned their entire day around moving shadows. Large trees, especially oaks and beeches, became unofficial gathering places, with families and neighbors camping beneath the leafy canopy. A patch of shade could be 10 to 15 degrees cooler than the surrounding area. That was the difference between misery and tolerable. Thick stone buildings like churches or castles also provided refuge. Their stone walls stayed cooler than wood or mud brick, so peasants would sit against them or rest in their shade. Church interiors were especially valuable, dark, cool, and spacious. Many people would show up early to services and stay long after they ended, milking every minute of that sweet stone-cooled air.
Water, of course, was the ultimate cooling solution, but it wasn't always easy to come by, and clean water was especially rare. Still, peasants flocked to rivers, ponds, and streams whenever possible. They'd cool their feet, splash their faces, and sometimes even sneak quick baths if no one was watching. The village well was often the coolest spot in town, drawing underground water that stayed refreshingly chilly year-round. Peasants had ingenious ways of maximizing limited water supplies for cooling. They'd soak cloth strips in cold water and wrap them around wrists, necks, or foreheads. As the water evaporated, it created a refreshing sensation that lasted up to an hour. This simple trick probably felt like magic in a world without AC. But the ultimate secret weapon against the heat was going underground. Root cellars, storage holes, even wells provided access to naturally cooler air, often around 50 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. When the summer became truly unbearable, peasants didn't hesitate to climb into these chilly retreats for temporary relief. Still, sometimes the best strategy was simply accepting the heat as inevitable. Medieval peasants cultivated a mental toughness unimaginable to modern people, learning to tolerate extreme discomfort and carry on with their lives, regardless of how sweltering the day became. This relentless summer heat influenced every part of life, including the food they ate. If you think cooking during a heat wave today is rough, just wait until you hear about medieval meals. The core of a peasant's diet was something called pottage, a thick soup cooked in huge iron pots over an open fire. It usually included barley, oats, onions, cabbage, and turnips, basically whatever scraps were available. Cooking pottage meant standing by a roaring fire, filling the already hot homes with steam and smoke. Eating hot soup when it was 90 degrees outside wasn't just uncomfortable, it was medieval self-torture. Bread was another staple that came with its own set of summer challenges. Individual ovens at home were rare, so entire villages shared communal ovens, massive stone structures heated with wood fires that reached scorching temperatures. These ovens baked dozens of loaves at a time, radiating heat in every direction. Eating this dense, freshly baked bread during summer felt like swallowing a hot brick that sat heavy in your stomach for hours. Fresh food was a luxury peasants couldn't waste, but summer heat made keeping things fresh almost impossible. Vegetables harvested from gardens had to be eaten quickly or they'd spoil, which meant eating them warm and wilted from the summer sun. Meat preservation techniques like salting, smoking, and drying helped extend shelf life, but produced incredibly salty, dense foods. Consuming salted pork, smoked fish, or dried meats on a hot day increased thirst and body heat, turning every bite into fuel for the fire within. Peasants drank ale constantly, up to a gallon or two a day, because it was safer than water and provided essential calories and nutrients. But brewing ale meant boiling water and grains, adding even more heat to an already scorching environment. Brewing ale during summer was like hosting a sauna party nobody wanted but everyone attended out of sheer necessity. Water itself was rarely safe to drink, because village water sources were often polluted by human and animal waste. Wells, streams, and ponds were typically located near outhouses or animal pens, making fresh drinking water scarce. This lack of safe drinking water forced peasants into relying heavily on ale, even when it meant enduring hotter homes and villages. Meal timing was another factor dictated by summer heat. The main meal of the day usually took place in late morning or early afternoon, right when temperatures were rising. This meant people were consuming their largest, hottest meal precisely when the heat was becoming most intense, turning lunchtime into something resembling a feast inside an oven. Dairy products were even trickier in summer months. Milk, cheese, and butter spoiled rapidly in the heat. Milk had to be consumed within hours, while cheesemaking became a frantic race against spoilage. Attempting cheesemaking during a heat wave was like trying to build a snowman in the desert, possible, but hardly worth the trouble. Despite these challenges, peasants adapted by shifting their entire daily routine. Medieval villages transformed during summer as people moved outdoors to escape the heat, turning streets and public spaces into bustling outdoor living areas. Village greens, central grassy or dirt areas, became lively outdoor workshops. Entire families moved spinning, weaving, and crafting tasks outdoors, seeking shade wherever possible. These village greens took on the look of sprawling outdoor factories, bustling with activity yet simmering under the hot sun. Churches became informal cooling centers. With their thick stone walls, high ceilings, and shaded interiors, they offered some of the coolest spots around. Villagers often arrived early for services and lingered long after, seizing any chance to enjoy the cool interiors. Public wells turned into essential social hubs, not only providing water but also giving people a chance to cool off, wash, and gossip. The areas surrounding wells were noticeably cooler, creating a welcome oasis from the sweltering heat. Rivers, streams, and ponds became communal cooling spots. Social rules relaxed out of sheer necessity, with people wading fully clothed, removing shoes, and even bathing openly if privacy allowed. The search for relief trumped concerns about modesty. Shade trees became priceless commodities, claimed early and defended throughout the day. Large oak, ash, and beech trees could shelter dozens of people beneath their broad canopies. Families would establish makeshift camps, bringing cushions, blankets, and work materials, creating shaded retreats that were considered more valuable than silver, because silver couldn't cool you down. Children enjoyed greater freedom to adapt to the heat. They spent entire days outdoors, often naked or barely clothed, splashing in streams, playing in mud puddles, and seeking out cool places adults were too dignified or stubborn to use. Taverns and alehouses adapted by moving their seating outdoors. Wooden tables and benches were dragged under whatever shade could be found, creating bustling outdoor dining spaces. These summer taverns didn't exactly cool you down, but after a few drinks, the heat became a little more tolerable. Summer heat fundamentally reshaped social interactions. People who usually kept to themselves were forced to mingle in communal cooling spots, creating interactions that simply didn't happen in cooling months. The oppressive heat became a social mixer, bringing villagers together whether they liked it or not. But all these adaptations still didn't solve one critical issue: sleep. When night fell, medieval peasants faced an even bigger challenge: how to rest in homes that had turned into ovens.
Summer nights brought no relief to medieval peasants. The thick walls and dense thatched roofs that trapped heat all day didn't suddenly cool down after sunset. Instead, homes slowly radiated the stored warmth throughout the night. Imagine trying to sleep inside a giant clay oven that had been left switched on overnight. That was the reality for most peasants. Because of this, sleep became a strategic endeavor requiring careful planning, flexibility, and a willingness to toss tradition out the window. Peasants adapted by rearranging their entire schedules around the heat, creating sleep patterns that would confuse modern people but made perfect sense at the time. To beat the worst of the heat, peasants woke long before dawn, often as early as 3 or 4 in the morning. These early hours offered precious coolness, so people quickly got to work, doing as many chores as possible before sunrise. By late morning, when temperatures started to soar, villages practically shut down. Peasants would retreat from the fields and take extended breaks until late afternoon. This midday rest wasn't a luxury, it was essential. From around noon until 4 p.m., entire communities sought the coolest spots they could find, resting quietly in shaded areas, beneath large trees, or even underground cellars. If you ventured into a medieval village at midday during summer, you'd find it eerily quiet. Everyone huddled in shaded corners or lying motionless in gardens, desperately waiting out the peak heat. Sleeping arrangements during these scorching summers were remarkably fluid. Peasant families frequently abandoned their beds altogether, sleeping anywhere they found cooler conditions. Mattresses stuffed with straw, blankets, and pillows were dragged outside, setting up temporary sleeping areas in gardens, courtyards, and even village streets. Entire villages turned into makeshift campgrounds, minus the tents. Inside homes, the packed earth or clay floors themselves became preferred sleeping spots. Lying directly on the ground felt cooler than being elevated on mattresses. Some peasants even dug shallow depressions in their floors, hoping to find slightly cooler soil beneath the surface. Comfort wasn't the goal, just a few degrees of relief. Sleep quality in summer was predictably terrible. Peasants typically managed only brief, restless periods of sleep, frequently interrupted by heat-induced discomfort. Nights became long sequences of uncomfortable naps, broken by constant shifting and repositioning. A restful night's sleep was practically unheard of. The concept of privacy all but disappeared. Families slept closely together, not by choice, but because they had to share whatever cooler spots they discovered. Everyone became accustomed to sharing sleeping spaces with multiple family members and neighbors. Personal space was sacrificed for collective survival. During harvest and other intense work periods, peasants would even split into shifts, taking turns sleeping and working through the cooler night hours. One group slept while the other labored, and then they'd switch roles at dawn. This shift system helped maximize productivity while ensuring everyone got at least some rest when conditions were most bearable. Children in particular adapted easily to summer sleep patterns. They took short naps throughout the day, curling up in cool spots adults might overlook and staying active in the evening when adults sought rest. Their flexible schedules allowed them to handle heat better than their exhausted parents. Mornings became the highlight of each day. The brief period between around 4 and 7 a.m. was often the only truly comfortable time peasants experienced. People treasured these quiet, cool hours, savoring the relief before the oppressive heat returned with full force.
Despite all these challenges, peasants developed an astonishing tolerance to the heat. But even they had limits. The relentless combination of hot days, restless nights, and demanding physical labor tested human endurance daily. Yet somehow they survived and adapted year after scorching year. Medieval peasants learned to cope with the heat in ways that modern people can hardly imagine. Their entire lives shifted outdoors during summer. Public spaces became living rooms, gardens turned into bedrooms, and village wells evolved into community hubs. They wore suffocating wool clothes in blistering temperatures and cooked meals over roaring fires that turned their homes into steam-filled ovens. And through all it, they managed to function, raise families, and build communities. Today, we enjoy air conditioning, cool clothing, and refreshing drinks on demand, luxuries unimaginable to medieval peasants. When you step into an air-conditioned building, sip cold water from your refrigerator, or wear shorts and sandals on a hot day, remember how people once lived, wrapped in heavy wool, sweating under layers of linen, sleeping on bare earth, and still somehow thriving despite constant discomfort. Their endurance teaches us something important. Human beings are remarkably resilient. When survival depends on adaptation, people find creative solutions. Medieval peasants couldn't change the weather, but they did change how they lived. They reshaped their schedules, adapted their clothes, and reimagined their communities, all to withstand relentless heat. Looking back at their struggles helps us appreciate the comfort we often take for granted. It reminds us that no matter how harsh the environment, people will always adapt, finding new ways to cope, to survive, and sometimes even thrive. So next time you find yourself complaining about a hot summer day, think about medieval peasants and the incredible lengths they went to just to stay cool. Their lives were a daily battle against heat, yet their communities thrived, their families grew, and their cultures endured. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel a little cooler in comparison. Remember, the comforts we have today aren't just conveniences. They're marvels of human ingenuity, born from generations of discomfort, trial, and error. Medieval peasants might not have lacked modern technology, but they didn't lack creativity, determination, or the sheer stubborn will to survive. Ultimately, their story isn't just about coping with heat. It's about human resilience. It's about adapting to the harshest conditions imaginable and emerging stronger, smarter, and tougher. So, as you crank up the AC or reach for that icy drink, spare a thought for those who came before us, people who survived summers without fans, refrigerators, or relief. Their struggles paved the way for the comforts we enjoy today, making every modern convenience a testament to their perseverance. After all, staying cool might seem simple now, but it was anything but easy in the medieval world.